Scale on the bathroom floor didn't lie, but it also didn't tell the whole story. It didn't show the 2 years of quiet, empty cribs, the cold white hospital corridors, or the heavy metallic taste of the fertility hormones that had flooded my body. It didn't show the quiet grief of 3 failed IVF cycles, or the silent, shattering pain of the miscarriage that followed. All it showed was a number that had slowly crept up, claiming the soft, slender version of me that Julian had married. I stared down at my feet on the cold white tile, my eyes tracing the faint, silvery stretch marks on my skin. Beside the porcelain sink sat my old hospital bracelet and a small plastic container filled with empty IVF syringes. They were silent, painful reminders of a long, heartbreaking battle my body had fought and lost. The house around me was too quiet, filled with expensive, modern furniture, and a heavy, suffocating silence that made it hard to breathe. I pulled my oversized, faded blue cardigan tighter around my body, trying to make myself as small as possible. I wanted to hide from the cold glass of the mirrors. I wanted to hide from the entire world. But most of all, I wanted to hide from the sound of the front door. I had tried so hard to carry our child, to carry our grief, and to carry the weight of Julian's changing eyes. But looking at myself now, I realized I was drowning in my own skin, and the man downstairs was slowly pulling away. Just then, the heavy wooden door clicked open downstairs. A familiar, quiet step echoed in the empty hallway, sending a cold shiver down my spine. Julian was home. Julian walked into the bedroom, his expensive dark gray suit perfectly pressed without a single wrinkle. He looked as sharp and polished as the modern glass buildings he designed for a living. But as his eyes drifted toward me, his face closed up, taking on that polite, distant look that had slowly replaced his warmth over the last year. He didn't smile. He didn't reach out to touch my shoulder. He just stood by the door, a cold barrier between me and the rest of the world. "Hey, Claire," he said, his voice quiet and level. It was the tone he used with clients when a project was falling behind schedule, gentle, professional, and entirely detached. "Hey, Julian," I murmured, my hand still gripping the edge of my faded blue cardigan. "How was your day?" "Busy," he replied, taking off his watch and placing it on the dresser. The metallic click of the band against the dark wood sounded like a tiny, sharp gavel ending a trial. "Just a lot of meetings." I had to stop by the gallery after work to check on the new layout. He didn't ask about my day. He didn't ask how my doctor's appointment had gone, or if the heavy, dull ache in my lower back had finally subsided after the last round of hormone therapy. Instead, he let his eyes linger on the empty plastic container of IVF syringes sitting beside the sink. A tiny, almost invisible flicker of disappointment crossed his face before he quickly looked away, staring out the window at the perfectly manicured lawns of our quiet, wealthy neighborhood. The silence between us stretched out, thick and heavy, filled with all the things we were too tired to say. We were standing in the same room, but we were miles apart, separated by the ghosts of the children we had lost. Julian loosened his silk tie, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look at me as he spoke, his gaze remaining fixed on the quiet street outside. "People are starting to notice, Claire," he said softly. His voice was completely devoid of anger, which somehow made the words feel much heavier. "At the gallery dinner last night, Sarah asked me if you were expecting again. I didn't even know what to say. I just stood there, trying to change the subject." I felt a sharp, familiar ache tighten in my chest. I pulled the cardigan tighter, trying to shield myself from his quiet judgment. "It's only been 3 months since the miscarriage, Julian. My body is still trying to heal from all the drugs." "I know," he replied, finally turning to look at me, but there was no sympathy in his eyes, only a deep, exhausted disappointment. "But I miss the woman you used to be. I don't recognize us anymore. Every time I look at you, I see the grief, and I see how much you've let yourself go. It's like you stopped trying." The word "stop trying" felt like a physical blow, knocking the air right out of my lungs. I had spent 2 years turning my body into a laboratory, enduring painful injections, bruised skin, and silent tears, all to give us a family. I had carried the physical weight of our shared loss, while he had simply watched from a safe distance. But looking at his clean, polished shoes and his distant, handsome face, I realized he was no longer looking at his wife. He was looking at a broken aesthetic. He wanted his perfect, slender partner back, and he was tired of waiting for the grief to clear. "If you don't recognize us anymore, Julian," I whispered, "then maybe you shouldn't have to look." Julian didn't argue. He didn't scream, and he didn't beg me to stay. He just let out a slow, tired sigh that seemed to seal our fate right there in the quiet bedroom. He picked up his watch from the dresser, slipped it back onto his wrist, and walked out, leaving me alone with the hum of the air conditioner and the crushing weight of my own thoughts. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where he had just been. The tears I expected didn't come. Instead, a strange, hollow coldness settled deep inside my chest. I walked over to the closet and pulled down my old canvas suitcase from the top shelf. It was dusty, unused since our honeymoon 4 years ago when we had laughed and planned a lifetime of adventures. Now, it felt like a heavy, final box. I opened it on the unmade bed and began to pack. I didn't take much. I didn't want the expensive designer dresses Julian had bought to make me fit into his gallery crowd. I didn't want the sparkling jewelry that felt like golden handcuffs. I only packed my basic cotton shirts, my most comfortable worn-out jeans, and a few old books that had belonged to my father. As I folded my softest, oversized sweaters, my hand brushed against a small, framed photo on the nightstand. It was a picture of me from 3 years ago, laughing on a beach, my body slender and my face free of care. I looked at it, then at my reflection in the dark window. I didn't hate the woman in the window anymore. I just felt incredibly sorry for her. She had fought so hard, only to be told she wasn't enough. I gently set the photo face down, closed the suitcase, and zipped it shut. The metal key felt incredibly heavy in my hand, its cool edges pressing into my palm. I stood in the center of the dark hallway, my single canvas suitcase resting by my boots. The house around me was beautiful, filled with expensive art, polished wood, and designer rugs, but it had never felt so empty. It was a showroom, not a home, and I was just an outdated piece of furniture that no longer fit the clean aesthetic. I walked over to the sleek marble kitchen island. With a slow, steady hand, I placed my house key onto the cold surface, right next to the designer bowl Julian had bought for our anniversary. The tiny clinking sound of the metal against the stone echoed through the quiet house like a final, permanent goodbye. I didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to explain, and there were no words that could bridge the silent miles that had grown between us. I grabbed the handle of my suitcase, took a deep breath of the cool, filtered air, and walked toward the front door. As I stepped over the threshold and out into the quiet, dark night, a gentle breeze brushed against my face, carrying the earthy, fresh scent of rain. I didn't look back at the grand brick house, and I didn't look up at the dark bedroom window. For 2 long years, I had been carrying a heavy, exhausting burden, trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect mother, and the perfect version of myself. But as the heavy front door clicked shut behind me, lock automatically sliding into place, I felt a strange, quiet sensation wash over my chest. For the first time in a very long time, I could finally breathe. The gray Greyhound bus rattled down the narrow, 2-lane highway, the steady hum of its worn-out engine acting like a dull lullaby. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the landscape slowly change. The towering glass buildings, the crowded gray sidewalks, and the endless sea of red brake lights of the city were gone now. In their place were rolling green hills, old wooden barns weathered by winters, and massive, ancient oak trees that looked as though they had stood there watching the world spin for centuries. We were deep in the American countryside now, a place where time seemed to slow down and take a long, deep breath. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. For the first time in years, they weren't trembling. There were no doctor's appointments scheduled for tomorrow, no calendar alerts reminding me of hormone dosages, and no quiet dinners where my husband's eyes would linger on my soft waistline with polite disappointment. The bus eventually squeaked to a halt outside a small, brick gas station with a faded blue roof. The sign nearby read, "Welcome to Oak Creek. Population 1,200. As I stepped off the metal stairs of the bus, holding the handle of my single canvas suitcase, the air hit me first. It didn't smell like car exhaust or expensive pavement. It smelled of wet earth, pine needles, and the clean, crisp promise of a coming autumn. I walked a few steps down the quiet, empty sidewalk. There were no rushing crowds pushing past me. A couple of old pickup trucks were parked outside a local diner, their engines quiet. I looked up at the vast, open sky, which felt incredibly wide compared to the narrow view from my old bedroom window. For so long, I had felt like a ghost walking through my own life. trying desperately to fit into a tiny, perfect box that wasn't built for me. But looking out at the endless horizon of this small town, I felt a tiny, quiet spark of hope flicker in my chest. My new home was a tiny, furnished studio apartment located above an old, quiet bakery at the edge of town. The stairs leading up to it were made of dark oak, creaking softly under my boots as I carried my heavy suitcase up. The landlord, a sweet elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, had smiled warmly when she handed me the key, her eyes lingering on my tired face but never once looking down at my body. She didn't ask why a woman with an empty wedding ring finger was moving into a small room with just one suitcase. In a small town like Oak Creek, people respected a quiet story. When I unlocked the door, the scent of vanilla and warm, freshly baked bread drifted up from the floorboards below, wrapping around me like a soft, familiar blanket. The room was simple, almost empty, but it felt incredibly safe. It had a small brass bed pushed against the far wall, a worn-out wooden rocking chair by the window, and a tiny kitchen corner with a single metal kettle. I set my canvas suitcase on the bed and walked over to the large window. The glass was old and slightly distorted, but it gave me a clear view of the quiet, tree-lined street below and the distant blue hills that framed the town. I spent the afternoon unpacking my few belongings, placing my cotton shirts and old jeans into the small wooden dresser. I took my time, enjoying the simple, quiet rhythm of folding each piece of clothing. There was no rush here, no schedule to keep, no social gallery dinners to prepare for, and no heavy expectations waiting for me in the next room. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of lavender and dusty pink, I sat down in the rocking chair. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the urge to hide from my own thoughts. The room was quiet, save for the gentle creak of the floorboards, but for the first time, the silence didn't feel suffocating. It felt like a clean slate. The next morning, the town of Oak Creek felt even smaller and more peaceful under the golden light of the early sun. I had spent the night in my new room, and for the first time in 2 years, I didn't wake up reaching for my phone to check my weight or my calendar. I simply woke up because the sun was touching my face. After a simple breakfast of toast and tea, I stepped out into the crisp morning air, determined to find a way to fill my days with something real, something that had nothing to do with aesthetics or appearances. I had heard rumors of an old greenhouse at the edge of the valley, a place that supplied the town with its flowers and fresh produce. I walked along the gravel road, my boots crunching rhythmically, enjoying the way the dirt path felt grounded and honest beneath me. The further I walked away from the town center, the more the air filled with the scent of wild honeysuckle and wet, rich soil. Finally I saw it, a large, sprawling structure made of aged glass panes and white-painted wood, partially covered in climbing ivy. It looked like a hidden jewel tucked away in a corner of the valley. It wasn't perfect. Some of the glass panes were cracked, and the paint was peeling in long, lazy strips, but it felt alive in a way that my modern, suburban house never had. I took a deep breath, smoothing down my oversized sweater, and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The transition was instant. The air inside was thick, warm, and humid, pulsing with the life of thousands of green plants. Ferns hung from the rafters, rows of colorful blossoms lined the benches, and the earth under my feet was soft and dark. It was a chaotic, beautiful sanctuary. My heart, which had been so guarded for so long, felt a sudden, strange tug. This wasn't a place where things were polished for show. This was a place where things simply grew. As I wandered deeper into the lush, green labyrinth of the greenhouse, the sound of rhythmic digging caught my attention. Tucked away behind a massive wall of leafy monsteras, an elderly man was kneeling on a wooden crate, his hands buried deep in a pot of dark, rich compost. He wore a simple flannel shirt that had seen better days and a pair of sturdy, dirt-stained overalls. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and a thick, white beard gave him the look of a wise, gentle hermit. He didn't look up when I approached, but I felt his presence, a calm, steady energy that seemed to blend perfectly with the surrounding greenery. This was Thomas, the man the townspeople had whispered about, the soul who understood the language of roots and leaves better than the language of men. "The soil is a bit dry today," he said, his voice deep and raspy, like dry leaves rustling underfoot. He finally turned to look at me, his eyes crinkling at the corners with a genuine, welcoming warmth that caught me off guard. He didn't scan me from head to toe, didn't notice my weight, and didn't wonder about my background. He simply looked at my eyes, reading the quiet weariness lingering there. I was looking for work, I said, my voice sounding small in the vast, quiet space of the greenhouse. I don't have much experience, but I'm a quick learner, and I don't mind getting my hands dirty. Thomas stood up slowly, dusting off his heavy gloves. He walked over to a rack of tools and picked up a clean trowel, holding it out toward me with a slow, deliberate movement. Experience is just another word for mistakes you've already made, Claire, he said, surprising me by using my name, even though I hadn't introduced myself yet. But here, we don't care about the past. We care about what you're willing to nurture today. You look like someone who understands what it means to be misunderstood. That makes you a gardener. He didn't need to ask for a resume or a reason for me to be there. He simply pointed to a row of wilting seedlings that needed transplanting. In that moment, for the first time in years, I felt seen for who I actually was, not for what I was supposed to be. Working under Thomas's watchful but gentle guidance felt like learning how to breathe all over again. The greenhouse was a world unto itself, governed not by clocks or expectations, but by the slow, steady cycle of the seasons. I spent my days moving through the rows, feeling the cool grit of the soil beneath my fingernails and the warmth of the sun through the aged, weathered glass panes above. It was simple, back-breaking labor, but it brought me a peace I hadn't known since I was a child. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, while Thomas was attending to some orders in the front office, I found myself venturing toward the far, shadowed corner of the property. This section was neglected, separated from the rest of the vibrant, blooming plants by a thick curtain of climbing ivy and a few rusted iron stands. It was the forgotten zone, where light barely touched the ground. As I pushed aside a heavy, trailing vine, my eyes fell upon a small terracotta pot tucked behind a stack of broken wooden crates. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a ball of dry, tangled twigs and dead leaves. But as I leaned in closer, brushing away the thick layer of gray dust, I saw a tiny, faint spark of green near the base of the stems. It was a jasmine plant, or at least the ghost of one. It was clearly starving for light and desperate for water, neglected for so long that its branches had twisted and hardened into a knot of misery. Most people would have tossed it into the compost pile, assuming it was too far gone to save. But as I looked at the fragile, struggling stems, I didn't see a dead plant. I saw a reflection of myself. I saw the parts of me that had been forced to harden just to survive the weight of the last 2 years. Without thinking, I carefully lifted the pot, cradling it in my arms as if it were something precious. I knew right then that I wasn't going to let this little life slip away. If I could save this jasmine, maybe, just maybe, I could learn how to bloom again, too. The routine of Oak Creek had become the rhythm of my heartbeat. Every morning, before the sun fully crested over the blue hills, I would wake up and head toward the lake. The water was a vast, glassy mirror that reflected the awakening sky, turning from a deep, velvety indigo to a soft, brushed gold. Walking along the shoreline, I listened to the rhythmic lap of water against the pebbles, a sound so ancient and steady that it made my own worries feel small, almost insignificant. The air in the early hours was biting, sharp enough to sting my cheeks, but it felt clean. It felt like reality. There were no filtered mirrors to hide behind, no expectations of how I should look or who I should be. Here I was just Claire. I wasn't the wife of a successful architect, and I wasn't the woman who had failed at the one thing she wanted most. I was simply a human being, walking on the earth, watching the world begin its day. I would often stop at the edge of the old wooden pier, where the wood was silvered by age and damp with morning mist. I would take a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with the scent of pine and cold water. It was a meditative practice, a way to anchor myself before the day began. I realized that for 2 years, I had been living in a state of constant, low-level panic, a desperate, clawing need to fix myself, to be thinner, to be more perfect, to be enough. But standing here, watching a lone heron lift off from the reeds and glide silently across the water, that panic began to dissolve. The lake didn't demand anything from me. The trees didn't judge my waistline. The wind didn't care about my past. Nature simply existed, and in its quiet indifference, I finally found the grace to let myself exist too. I wasn't healed yet, not completely, but for the first time I was moving forward. Back at the greenhouse, the jasmine plant I had rescued, the one I'd named Jasmine, was starting to show signs of life. I kept her on a small, sun-drenched shelf right by the main entrance, where she could catch the early morning rays and the gentle afternoon warmth. Every day, I approached her with the same care I was trying to cultivate within myself. I trimmed away the dead, brittle twigs that had served their purpose during the harsh winter, and I watered her with a steady, mindful hand. It wasn't a sudden transformation. It was a slow, agonizingly beautiful process of recovery. One afternoon, while I was carefully wiping the dust from a new, tiny leaf that had unfurled, Thomas walked up behind me. He didn't say anything at first, just watched with a knowing, gentle smile. "She's a fighter," he noted, his voice barely a whisper. "Most people look at a plant like that and only see the damage. They don't see the will to keep pushing upward, no matter how starved the soil is. It takes time for the roots to remember they're allowed to grow." I looked at the tiny green sprout, then back at my own hands, which were now permanently marked by the soil and the work of the greenhouse. I realized that, like the jasmine, I had been carrying the weight of my own winter for far too long. I had been pruning myself to fit into Julian's vision, cutting away parts of my personality, my joy, and my genuine self until I was just a shell. "She's not just growing, Thomas," I said, my voice steady and clear. "She's finally breathing. I think I'm just starting to learn how to do that, too." He patted my shoulder, a rare grounding gesture, and moved on to check the irrigation lines. I turned back to the plant, feeling a deep, quiet sense of pride. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the growth that was waiting for me. One afternoon, just as I was preparing to close the greenhouse for the day, Mrs. Gable from the bakery walked over, her face wearing a sympathetic look I hadn't seen in weeks. She held a thick cream-colored envelope in her hands. It was addressed to me, but the handwriting was unmistakable, a sharp, elegant script that I had spent years trying to live up to. It was from Julian. My heart hammered against my ribs, a sudden, sharp reminder of the world I had left behind. I stared at the envelope, the familiar wax seal feeling like a heavy, cold weight. I hadn't heard a word from him since I left, and I had spent every day since then carefully constructing a new life that didn't include his expectations or his silent, judging presence. I took the letter from Mrs. Gable, murmuring a quiet thanks, and walked to the back of the greenhouse to sit by my little jasmine plant. For a long time, I just held it. I thought about the woman I was in that house, the woman who constantly checked her reflection, the woman who felt the crushing weight of 3 failed IVF cycles, and the woman who thought she was defined by her husband's approval. I looked at the soil under my nails, the worn-out sweater I was wearing, and the plant that was finally beginning to thrive because I had given it space to be itself. I realized that this letter was a test. It was an invitation back into the cage, a chance to resume the role of the perfect wife, provided I was willing to sacrifice my sanity once more. My hands didn't shake as I reached for the letter opener. I wasn't the same woman who had left that house with a suitcase full of sorrow. I carefully sliced through the thick paper, ready to face whatever words he had written, no longer afraid of the man or the history he represented. I was finally ready to define my own story. I unfolded the thick cream-colored stationery. The scent of Julian's expensive cologne, a crisp, citrus-heavy fragrance, seemed to rise from the page, instantly transporting me back to that sterile, glass-walled bedroom. The handwriting was as perfect as I remembered, every letter slanted at the exact same angle, devoid of any messy human hesitation. "Claire," the letter began, "it's been months, and the silence in this house is becoming unbearable. I've realized that my reaction to your struggle was inadequate. I've been busy with the new museum project, but I find myself looking for you in the kitchen, in the hall, in the quiet spaces of our home. I've spoken with a new specialist, someone who suggests a different protocol, a higher success rate. Come home. Let's try again, this time with the right resources. You belong here with the life we built, not in some forgotten town I've never heard of. I've already contacted the movers to pick up whatever belongings you took. Expect them on Tuesday." I stopped reading. My thumb traced the edge of the paper, feeling the heavy grain. There was no mention of how I was doing, no concern for my health, or the 2 years of emotional devastation I had endured. It was all us, our home, and the right resources. He was viewing our marriage like a faulty building design that just needed a structural reinforcement to be habitable again. A strange, cold clarity washed over me. He wasn't asking for his wife back. He was asking for his life to be restored to its previous, aesthetic state. He didn't want the woman who had learned to find peace in the soil. He wanted the woman who could smile through the pain at a gallery opening. I looked up at my jasmine plant, its leaves of vibrant, healthy green, and then back at the letter. It was an echo from a ghost town, a relic of a version of myself that no longer existed. I didn't feel angry. I didn't even feel sad. I just felt finished. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, golden shadows across the greenhouse floor. I sat on the wooden crate, the letter from Julian resting lightly on my lap. The words, which once would have sent me into a spiral of self-doubt and longing, now felt like nothing more than ink on a page, dry, hollow, and ultimately irrelevant. He was still living in the same sterile, unyielding world, trying to command the future as if it were a floor plan he could redraw. I didn't need to cry. I didn't need to pace the room, frantic and confused. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small, worn-out pencil I used for labeling plant pots, and took a blank sheet of scrap paper from the workbench. I didn't need a fancy desk or expensive stationery. The truth didn't require ornamentation. I wrote only a few lines, my handwriting steady and unhurried. Julian, the resources you speak of were never what I needed. I needed a partner who saw my pain instead of a project that needed fixing. I am not the missing piece in your perfect life, and I am certainly not coming back to be reshaped. The woman you are looking for doesn't live in that house anymore, and she doesn't live in your memories either. Please don't send the movers. There is nothing of mine left there for you to return. I have found my own ground, and for the first time I am actually growing. Stay in your world and let me live in mine. Claire. I folded the paper, placed it back into the cream-colored envelope, and sealed it. I knew exactly what I was going to do with it. Tomorrow I would walk to the small post office in town and send it back to the city. It wasn't an act of spite, it was an act of finality. As I stood up and brushed the dirt from my jeans, I took one last look at the greenhouse. I was no longer the woman who had arrived with a single suitcase and a heart full of shadows. I was home. Spring had arrived in full force, but I no longer felt the desperate, hurried need to keep pace with the world. My life had narrowed down to the essentials: the cool dampness of the soil, the changing light against the glass panes, and the quiet, steady rhythm of the greenhouse. My work was no longer a chore, it was a meditation. Every morning, long before the mist cleared from the lake, I would join Thomas in the back section of the greenhouse, where the air was always rich with the scent of wet earth and ancient pine. Thomas was a man of few words, and that was exactly what I needed. He worked with a deliberate, slow grace, his shears cutting through deadwood with practiced precision. He never pried into my past, and he never asked me why I had arrived in Oak Creek with nothing but a single suitcase and a broken spirit. He simply handed me a pair of gloves and taught me how to prune. Claire, he said one morning, pausing to gesture at a tangled mass of ivy that had choked a small sapling, you're trying too hard to save the dead parts. Look at this. The energy is being wasted on what's already gone. If you want the new growth to survive, you have to be brave enough to let the old stuff fall away. His words struck me with the weight of a sudden realization. I had been carrying the memory of my perfect city life, the expectations, the failed treatments, the constant need for validation, like a heavy, dry root system that was choking my present. I looked at my hands, now calloused and stained with dirt, and realized they were finally clean in a way they had never been in my old life. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was beginning to take root. Thomas's presence was becoming a quiet anchor in my life. Those afternoons spent in the greenhouse were more therapeutic than any clinical session I had ever attended in the city. We often worked in a comfortable, heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic snip of his pruning shears or the distant, mournful call of a loon on the lake. I began to realize that we weren't just tending to plants, we were mirroring the process of my own internal landscape. One Tuesday, while we were repotting a batch of delicate perennials, I found myself watching him, the way his calloused hands moved with such intentional gentleness. He didn't demand conversation, and he certainly didn't press for details about why a woman like me had ended up in Oak Creek with nothing but a carry-on suitcase. You've stopped checking your watch, he remarked suddenly, not looking up from his work. I paused, realizing he was right. In my old life, my day was partitioned into 60-minute increments. Gym, appointments, social obligations, the inevitable shoulds. Here, time was measured by the movement of the sun across the glass roof and the gradual unfurling of new leaves. I don't think I need to know the time anymore, I replied, feeling a genuine smile touch my lips. For the first time, I think I'm actually in the day, rather than just waiting for it to end. He nodded slowly, a small, knowing glint in his eyes. He understood that my healing wasn't a destination I was traveling toward. It was a state of being I was finally allowing myself to inhabit. The jasmine, the plant I had rescued, remained a mystery of patient endurance. She sat on her designated shelf, a small, vibrant green contrast to the sun-bleached wood of the greenhouse. She hadn't bloomed, and in the beginning, that lack of progress used to gnaw at me. I would hover over her, checking the moisture in the soil, adjusting her position for maximum light, worried that my touch was too clumsy to coax out the beauty I knew was hidden within. But as the weeks bled into a slow, golden haze, I stopped hovering. I had placed an old, cushioned chair near her shelf, a place where I spent my afternoons reading or simply watching the way the shadows stretched across the floor. My life had become a collection of these quiet, unhurried moments. I had taken the old, high-end designer jewelry that Julian had gifted me, the diamonds and gold that once felt like heavy chains, and tucked them away into the bottom of my trunk. They were artifacts from a woman who didn't exist anymore, relics that had no currency in this valley. I started keeping a journal again, but the pages weren't filled with the frantic lists or the cold, clinical observations of my past. Instead, I wrote about the way the light hit the lake in the evenings, about the kindness of Mrs. Gable, and the simple, profound joy of having a day that didn't demand perfection. One afternoon, while I was writing, I glanced at the jasmine. She was still just a tightly closed, unassuming bud, but she didn't look starved or brittle anymore. She looked steady. I realized then that we were mirroring each other. I wasn't rushing towards some grand, dramatic healing, and I wasn't waiting for a sign that I was fixed. I was simply existing in the quiet, and for the first time, that was enough. The waiting wasn't an empty space, it was part of the growing. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the surrounding hills, the entire valley would slip into a soft, golden twilight. This was my favorite time of day. The greenhouse, usually humid and warm, would begin to cool, and the scent of damp moss and evergreen became more pronounced. Often, Mrs. Gable would wander down from her bakery, a basket of fresh, rustic bread in her arm. We would sit on the worn bench just outside the glass doors, watching the stars slowly prick through the violet sky. She didn't press me for stories or gossip. Instead, she spoke of the valley's history, of the generations of families who had tended these same plots, and how the land had a way of healing those who were willing to listen to it. "You look different, Claire," she mentioned one evening, her voice barely rising above the rustle of the evening breeze. "When you first arrived, your shoulders were pulled so tight, I thought you might snap. Now you carry yourself like you belong to the earth." I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the greenhouse. She was right. I wasn't wearing the structured, expensive clothes of my past. I was dressed in soft cottons, my hair loose, and my eyes clear of the frantic, searching energy that had defined me for years. I didn't feel the need to be put together for anyone. "I think I'm just finally hearing my own voice," I whispered, the words feeling true for the first time. I spent so long trying to be the person everyone else expected that I forgot how to simply be. This place. It doesn't ask me to be anything other than human. She patted my hand, a gesture of quiet solidarity. There were no dramatic confessions, no tears, just a peaceful acknowledgement of a life that was finally, truly my own. We sat in the deepening quiet, two women connected by nothing more than the simplicity of the moment. The greenhouse felt like a sanctuary that night, wrapped in the deep, velvet silence of the valley. I had chosen to stay late, finding comfort in the solitude. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic ticking of an old clock on the wall and the gentle rustle of leaves in the night air. I sat on my chair by the shelf, watching the faint outline of the jasmine plant against the glass. It was still just a closed, modest bud, a small, dark silhouette against the moonlit landscape. I didn't feel the urge to urge it open. I didn't feel the need to accelerate its journey. I realized that my own transformation had been exactly like this, slow, invisible, and entirely necessary. I thought about the woman I was just months ago, the one who measured her worth in medical reports, gallery invitations, and her husband's approving glances. That woman felt like a character in a book I had read a long time ago. Now, in this space, there was no pressure to perform. There was only the soil, the changing seasons, and the quiet, steady work of being alive. Thomas's words from weeks ago echoed in the stillness. Growing in silence is the greatest strength. I closed my eyes and took a deep, steady breath, filling my lungs with the clean, cool air. I wasn't fixed. I was simply becoming something new, something that didn't need to be perfect to be worthy. As the night deepened, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. The world outside, with its demands and its noise, felt 1,000 miles away. Here, in the quiet, I was finally enough. I wasn't waiting for the bloom anymore, I was just grateful to be part of the garden. The weeks that followed were defined by a subtle, almost imperceptible change. It wasn't marked by grand gestures, but by the steady accumulation of quiet days. In the greenhouse, Thomas remained a steadfast mentor, his guidance strictly professional and grounded. He began to entrust me with more sensitive tasks, the delicate propagation of ferns and the precise misting of seedlings. I was no longer just a spectator, I was an active participant in the greenhouse's survival. One afternoon, while I was organizing the shed, I found a small, dusty box of heirloom seeds. Thomas walked in, his expression neutral. "Those were my wife's," he said quietly. I felt a pang of regret for prying, but he simply nodded. "It's time they were planted. Keep them, Claire, use them well." He didn't linger or offer sentimental comfort. He returned to his work, leaving me the space to process the weight of that legacy on my own terms. As the days blended into a seamless tapestry of chores, the boundary between Thomas and me remained clear. He was a man who had stepped out of the noise of the world, and I was a woman trying to find the volume of my own voice again. One afternoon, while we were securing trellises, the wind picked up, rattling the glass panes. Thomas worked on a high beam, his movements efficient and focused. I stood below, steadying the ladder, my mind purely on the task. When he climbed down, he offered a brief nod of thanks. No lingering looks, no unnecessary physical closeness. "You have a sharp eye for structure, Claire," he noted, his voice carrying the calm authority of a teacher. "The frame is what matters. Without it, the plant never reaches the light." I understood him perfectly. I had spent years trying to make my life look perfect on the outside while the foundation was rotting. Here, under his steady guidance, I was rebuilding the base. The morning after a light storm brought a crisp clarity to Oak Creek. I walked into town to pick up supplies at Mrs. Gable's bakery. As I stood in line, I heard a news report from the city mentioning a project I had once led. For a heartbeat, the old anxiety clawed at my throat, the pressure of the boardroom, the frantic need for validation. I gripped my bag until my knuckles went white. Mrs. Gable, sensing the sudden tension, gently placed a basket of fresh bread on the counter. "You have that look again, Claire," she whispered. "The look of someone who thinks they are still running." I forced a breath, the smell of the warm bread grounding me. "I am not running anymore," I replied, though my voice wavered. She smiled knowingly. "Then stop looking over your shoulder. The past is a map, not a destination." Her simple wisdom was exactly the emotional trigger I needed to stay anchored in the present. Days turned into a steady, rhythmic cycle of work. The greenhouse was no longer just a workplace, it was a laboratory of self-reflection. I spent hours clearing weeds, the physical exertion acting as a balm for my racing thoughts. I thought about Julian, but the sharp, jagged resentment was fading into a hollow neutrality. He was a chapter that had ended, not the entire book. Thomas watched me work, rarely speaking unless necessary. When he did offer feedback, it was constructive and direct. "You are pushing too hard on that root, Claire," he would say. "Give it space. It knows how to grow." He wasn't just talking about the plants, he was teaching me the art of letting go. I was beginning to realize that my worth wasn't tied to the pace of my progress, but to the honesty of my efforts. By the time the lilies began to sprout, the atmosphere in the greenhouse had shifted. The heirloom seeds were taking hold, a silent testament to a history I was now helping to preserve. I had stopped comparing my journey to the fast-paced life I'd left behind. My hands were stained with dirt, my muscles ached, and I felt more alive than I had in a decade. That evening, standing at the greenhouse entrance, I looked at the jasmine plant. She was still a bud, closed, firm, and content. I didn't feel the need to urge her open. I understood now that patience wasn't an empty space, it was part of the growth. The future didn't feel like a threat anymore, it felt like a garden, and for the first time, I knew I had the strength to tend it.